The winter of 1867 had laid its grip upon Essex County with a severity that men swore had not been felt in a generation. Snow lay heavy upon the gabled roofs of the little Massachusetts town of Ashford, muting the sound of carriage wheels and the tramp of boots. The Merrimack River, black and swollen in autumn, had frozen to an iron stillness, and along its edges, where the current pressed hardest, jagged ice cracked and groaned like some vast living beast caught in a snare. It was along this river that the first whispers began, though even weeks later, when the official accounts were collected, few agreed precisely upon what had been seen. A group of fishermen claimed they had sighted a boy wandering the banks one evening at dusk, his form pale against the dark line of trees. They shouted to him, but he gave no reply, only turning his head with an uncanny slowness, as though the sound of human voice was something foreign. Others swore that he had been discovered crouching beside the river's edge, staring intently at the frozen water, as though it held secrets invisible to ordinary eyes. Still others insisted he had simply been standing in the snow, barefoot, motionless, and unaffected by the bitter cold that burned even seasoned farmers through their wool coats. When at last he was brought into town, carried half by force and half by persuasion, there were no papers upon him, no name, no sign of origin. His hair was the ashen shade of smoke, his skin curiously unmarked by wind or frost, and his eyes, those eyes that men would remember for years to come, were a liquid silver, never still, glimmering in lantern light as if lit from within. Some villagers called him angel, others devil, and more than one woman crossed herself in haste at the sight of him. Timothy Caldwell, a schoolmaster with aspirations toward science, was summoned that night to the meeting house, where the boy sat wrapped in a borrowed blanket. Caldwell was 34 years of age, bookish and careful, his spectacles forever sliding down the bridge of his nose. He prided himself on measured observation and had written small articles for provincial journals on the chemical properties of mineral waters and the curious magnetism of lodestones. He had little patience for superstition and less for hysteria. Yet the moment his eyes fell upon the boy, something within him trembled. The child, or youth, for his age was difficult to guess, sat upon the bench without fidget or complaint, his small bare feet resting directly upon the floorboards. It was not merely the absence of shivering that disturbed Caldwell, it was the utter lack of reaction to his environment. Most children pulled at their coverings, scratched, or shifted uneasily under scrutiny. This one only regarded the assembly with that strange, calm attention, as though they were insects pinned beneath glass and he the naturalist examining them. "Boy," the pastor asked gently, "what is your name?" The silver eyes flicked toward him, and the boy's lips parted. A sound emerged, but it was not English. It was not French, nor the Irish tongue some of the laborers brought from across the sea. The syllables were soft, fluid, layered with inflections that did not belong to any language Caldwell had encountered in his books. The pastor frowned, while the townsfolk murmured uneasily. Caldwell stepped closer, his scholar's curiosity overcoming his hesitation. "Repeat it," he urged. The boy obeyed, the sequence of tones spilling forth again, now with faint variations, as if language itself shifted upon his tongue like smoke. Caldwell took out his notebook and attempted to transcribe, but the characters faltered beneath his pen. He could not determine where one word ended and another began, nor whether they were words at all. Later accounts diverged sharply here. Some said the boy spoke in a tongue of devils, that his utterances made milk curdle and lamps dim. Others insisted that though they understood nothing, the voice filled them with inexplicable sorrow, as if mourning some distant loss. A woman swore her stillborn infant stirred in its grave that very night, though such testimony was dismissed as hysteria born of grief. Caldwell, however, wrote with precise restraint, "The child speaks in a manner unlike any recorded tongue. The intonation is neither guttural nor nasal, but strangely resonant, as though produced not solely by the organs of the throat, but by some cavity deeper within the chest." By order of the town elders, the boy was entrusted to Caldwell's care. It was believed the schoolmaster, with his reputation for rationality, would determine the child's origin and nature. Some whispered that no ordinary family would claim him, and others muttered that perhaps it was best if none did. Caldwell accepted the charge with solemnity, telling himself he acted in the spirit of inquiry and compassion alike. Yet, as he led the boy through the snow-choked streets toward his modest dwelling, he felt the unease of a man carrying home not a ward, but a riddle too vast for his mind. The following nights deepened the strangeness. Caldwell observed that the boy required little in the way of sustenance. Bread and broth he touched sparingly, and he refused milk entirely. His eyes, however, followed the flame of the hearth with unbroken attention. When lanterns guttered in the wind, the light would leap unnaturally high the instant his gaze fell upon it, as if flame sought recognition in him. Caldwell recorded these phenomena carefully, refusing to assign cause, though his handwriting grew increasingly jagged in those pages. The first true alarm occurred on the third evening. Caldwell, having retired to his study, left his journal upon the desk. Sometime in the black hours of night he stirred, sensing movement. The lamp still burned, though he was certain he had extinguished it. There, standing over the open pages, was the boy. He made no sound, but his hand hovered a hair's breadth above the ink. Caldwell blinked in disbelief as letters rose faintly from the paper, suspended in the air like smoke rings, drifting upward and dissolving into nothingness. Caldwell cried out, and at once the phenomenon ceased. The boy turned those mercurial eyes upon him, and for the first time spoke in words Caldwell could grasp, not English, not fully, but syllables echoing his own name. Timo, thy. The sound was halting, as though language were a garment newly donned. Caldwell, shaken, demanded explanation, but the boy merely tilted his head with that same detached curiosity. Fear and fascination warred in Caldwell's mind. Each detail he recorded with clinical precision, yet in his private reflections he confessed that science provided no footing for what unfolded before him. He considered the possibility of ventriloquism, of hallucination brought on by sleeplessness, of some clever trick of light. Yet the memory of those letters, ink unpinned from paper, refused to submit to rational dismissal. Meanwhile, the village had not ceased its mutterings. Farmers crossed themselves when Caldwell and the boy passed on the lane. Children, emboldened by distance, hurled stones that stopped short in the snow as though striking an unseen barrier. The pastor counseled patience, but there were whispers of exorcism and darker talk of what to do if such rites failed. Caldwell's own pupils whispered that their master kept a witch child in his home, and enrollment at the schoolhouse began to dwindle. Caldwell resolved to isolate the boy further from the gossip, keeping him within the confines of the house, save for brief excursions into the surrounding woods. Yet even there, strangeness followed. Birds fell silent when the boy approached. Dogs whimpered and retreated. Once, while crossing the frozen brook, Caldwell slipped upon the ice, and before he could strike the ground, he felt a force seize him, unseen yet undeniable, halting his fall as though invisible hands steadied him. He turned, breathless, to see the boy watching, eyes aglow with that argent light. It was then, more than at any other moment, that Caldwell began to fear not for the boy, but for himself. For science could classify storms, chart the stars, and measure the mineral content of stones. But here before him stood a being that conformed to no law known to man. And though Caldwell's notebooks grew heavy with observation, they offered no answer to the question that had begun to gnaw at the marrow of his being. What, in God's name, had come walking from the river that winter? The weeks that followed the boy's arrival passed in a fashion both ordinary and entirely unordinary, for though the days of Ashford were still bound by the plodding rhythm of winter, the atmosphere surrounding Timothy Caldwell's modest dwelling grew charged with a quality that defied explanation. If the town itself did not yet erupt into outright hysteria, it was only because superstition thrives in whispers before it flames in action. Caldwell, for his part, found himself both custodian and investigator, caring for the boy as one might for a fragile charge, while simultaneously observing him with the vigilance of a man who suspects each ordinary act might conceal some revelation. At first there were small peculiarities, details that could be explained away if one possessed a firm enough commitment to rationality. A compass needle on Caldwell's desk, placed there for no greater purpose than to teach schoolchildren the principles of magnetism, began to quiver and spin whenever the boy entered the study. Once, when the child's gaze lingered too long upon it, the needle revolved with such violence that the glass cracked. Caldwell recorded the event without commentary, yet privately, he turned the instrument over in his hands again and again, searching for any hidden mechanism that might account for it. The boy himself remained a riddle of silence. He slept little, resting in the armchair near the fire rather than in the narrow bed Caldwell prepared for him. He spoke rarely, and when he did, the words seemed to belong to no tongue known upon earth. On certain evenings, Caldwell would sit with him, repeating simple phrases of bread, water, book, with the patience of a tutor guiding a dull pupil. Occasionally, the boy imitated the sounds, but always with an uncanny flatness, as though he were not learning language so much as echoing vibrations. More than once, Caldwell had the disquieting impression that the boy was not attempting to grasp human speech at all, but rather dissecting it, reducing each word into its constituent notes as one might unravel a musical chord. There was one incident, however, that marked the true beginning of dread. Caldwell had retired to bed one night with the intention of writing further observations in the morning. A storm rattled the shutters, and the oil lamp upon his bedside table flickered low. He drifted toward sleep, yet some disturbance roused him, a faint glow, brighter than the fire, seeping from under his study door. Rising in alarm, he crossed the hall and pushed the door open. What he beheld made his blood seize. The boy stood at the desk, his hand extended above the open notebook. The lamplight swelled unnaturally, its flame stretching upward as if drawn toward the child's small form. The shadows along the walls trembled, lengthening and distorting until the room seemed alive with motion. Caldwell's eyes were drawn to the page. The ink itself had lifted from the paper in delicate threads, suspended in the air like black cobwebs, forming shapes that shifted and shimmered in patterns beyond comprehension. The boy's gaze was fixed upon them with a concentration that suggested not wonder, but intent. When Caldwell cried out, the flame collapsed, the ink fell harmlessly back upon the page, and the boy turned with that same eerie composure. For the briefest moment, Caldwell thought he saw recognition in those argent eyes, as though the child knew precisely the effect his actions had produced, and had only been interrupted. "What are you?" Caldwell whispered, not expecting a reply. Yet the boy's lips moved, forming syllables almost recognizable, almost shaped into his name, Timothy, though distorted as though his very mouth resisted the structure of human words. Caldwell, trembling, dismissed the boy with a gesture, returning him to the armchair by the fire. But sleep did not return to the schoolmaster that night, and his journal bore the tremors of a man shaken from the certainty of reason. From that point onward, small disturbances multiplied. On one morning, when Caldwell reached for his spectacles, he found the glass fogged with condensation despite the warmth of the hearth. The boy, seated nearby, exhaled softly, and the fog vanished, though no breath touched the lenses. Another time, while crossing the schoolyard with him, Caldwell saw a group of older children jeering from a distance, tossing pebbles. Yet before any could strike their mark, each stone halted midair and dropped lifelessly into the snow, as though its momentum had been sucked from it. The children fled screaming, and Caldwell could provide no explanation to himself, save that his companion was no ordinary orphan. Word of these occurrences reached the town with the inevitability of smoke rising from flame. In taverns and parlors, whispers grew. A farmer swore that his livestock had sickened the day the boy passed near his barn. A mother claimed her infant, gazing upon the boy's silver eyes, began to babble in a man's voice before collapsing into silence. Such reports might have been dismissed as exaggerations born of fear, yet they accumulated like snow upon a roof, each flake negligible, the weight together threatening collapse. Caldwell attempted to shield the boy from gossip by keeping him indoors, yet his own journals betrayed a creeping uncertainty. His entries shifted from calm descriptions of experiment to increasingly desperate speculation. He questioned whether the child's presence was not merely anomalous but disruptive, a catalyst that unsettled natural law wherever he trod. One evening, while reviewing lessons with his pupils by lamplight, Caldwell felt a sudden draft stir the flame. Looking up, he saw the boy at the window, staring outward. The glass rattled faintly, and outside, the branches of a bare elm twisted as though caught in a gale, though the night was calm. The students gasped, and one girl clutched a crucifix at her neck. Caldwell dismissed them early, his face composed but his hands cold with sweat. Alone with the boy, he demanded answers, yet the child merely turned those luminous eyes upon him. For a heartbeat, Caldwell thought he glimpsed a depth within them that defied description, neither malice nor innocence, but something vast, like the reflection of stars upon water. He recoiled, ashamed of his own fear. The culmination of these signs came during a Sunday service, when the townspeople gathered at the church despite the storm that had battered the countryside all morning. Caldwell, wishing neither to isolate the boy nor to stoke rumor, brought him along, seating him at the rear. The sermon droned on, the pastor's voice carrying over the howling wind. Yet as the congregation bowed their heads in prayer, a peculiar silence descended. The storm outside seemed to hush, the very timbers of the church settling into an unnatural stillness. When the people raised their eyes, they found the boy standing, though Caldwell swore he had not moved from his seat. His gaze was fixed upon the altar candles. Slowly, impossibly, the flames bent toward him as if compelled. A murmur spread through the pews, growing into cries of alarm. Caldwell seized the boy's arm and dragged him out, but the damage was done. From that hour, there would be no restraining the town's fear. Caldwell's private journal from that week survives, though its later pages are halved, charred. In his cramped hand he wrote, "The phenomena increase. Instruments fail in his presence. Flame obeys his will. Stones halt in air. He requires little sustenance, little rest. At times I believe he observes me as one dissects a specimen, as if I am the experiment, not he. The rational mind recoils, yet the evidence admits no denial. If he is natural, then nature conceals laws yet undiscovered. If he is not, then what walks beside me?" By the month's end, the boy's presence had altered Caldwell's life beyond recognition. His pupils dwindled, parents fearing contamination of the spirit if not the flesh. Neighbors avoided his path. Each night he sat by the fire, studying the boy, listening to the strange cadence of his murmured speech, wondering whether the child belonged to mankind at all. The boy's eyes glimmered in the firelight, steady and silver, as if reflecting not the flames before him, but some light from a place far beyond their world. And it was then, as Caldwell's pen scratched the closing line of his observation, that the lamp beside him flared with sudden brilliance, white and searing, and for the briefest instant, the walls of his modest home seemed to dissolve into shadows. Caldwell shielded his eyes. When he looked again, the boy was watching him closely, lips curved in what might have been the faintest echo of a smile. At first the whispers spread like frost along the edges of glass, thin, delicate, and easily wiped away. But whispers like frost return thicker with each night, until at last the pane is obscured and all within can no longer see the world beyond. So it was in Ashford. What had begun as quiet remarks in tavern corners and hurried exchanges between neighbors swelled into something heavier, more enduring, until the very air of the village seemed to quiver with suspicion. It was not merely that a strange child lived under the roof of Timothy Caldwell, though that was fuel enough. It was that the presence of the child coincided with a string of events that, to the minds of farmers and seamstresses and devout mothers, could not be coincidence. The first tale to take root concerned the livestock of Jonah's Wright, a dairyman whose barn stood on the road leading eastward from the schoolhouse. Wright swore that on the morning after the pale boy had passed his gate, 2 of his cows were found dead, their bodies untouched by predator, their eyes clouded in an unnatural way. Wright's testimony, told with the trembling sincerity of a man who knew no art of embellishment, carried weight. There was no blood, he said, repeating it often, no wound, no sickness in them the night before. They was hale beasts, and by morning they lay stiff, as if the Lord himself had struck them down. Soon neighbors retold the tale with added flourishes. The cows were found burned, the udders withered, the flesh spoiled in an instant. Another story followed hard upon it. A mother, Lydia Markham, insisted that her infant son, no more than 10 months old, had looked into the boy's strange silver eyes during a chance meeting in the street. That night, she claimed, the child awoke shrieking, his tiny mouth spilling forth not the babble of infancy, but words in the voice of a grown man. It was deep, like a minister preaching damnation. She sobbed to any who would listen. By morning, the baby was silent, listless, and would not feed for 3 days. Though the child recovered in time, the tale required no evidence to lodge itself in the mind of every villager who heard it. It was not only rumor that fueled the fire, tangible signs, or what seemed such, abounded. Lanterns were reported to sputter out when the boy walked by. A mare bolted without cause, breaking her reins, the moment he passed her stall. The miller's dog, a loyal beast known for guarding his master's yard, growled and slunk away each time it scented the child. Every such detail was repeated, magnified, embroidered, until the boy's name was never spoken plainly, but with lowered voice and furtive glance. Caldwell, meanwhile, attempted with mounting desperation to stem the tide. He spoke in defense of his ward at the tavern, at the post office, even at the churchyard gate. You mistake coincidence for cause, he argued. Animals fall ill in winter, lamps are subject to draught, children's fevers make them cry strange, there is no devilry here. His words, however, fell on ears that had already decided the nature of truth. To men and women unversed in science, evidence meant little beside fear, and fear was abundant. Even his own pupils betrayed the mood. At the schoolhouse, children whispered that their master kept a witch child under his roof. Some refused to enter the room if the boy was present, and enrollment dwindled. Caldwell found himself lecturing to half-empty benches, the students' eyes darting toward the pale figure who sat apart, silent, expression unreadable. He persevered, convinced that the discipline of knowledge must hold against the flood of superstition. Yet even his own resolve wavered when he caught the boy gazing at a page of arithmetic, as though seeing not numbers but the hidden machinery of the universe itself. The pastor, Reverend Alden, visited Caldwell one evening, cloak heavy with snow. They sat by the hearth, the boy nearby, and spoke in hushed tones. Alden, a gentle man not given to rash judgment, admitted his unease. "I have prayed on it, Timothy," he said. "I find no scripture that speaks plainly to this matter. He may be an orphaned creature in need of Christian charity, yet if he brings temptation or delusion, we cannot ignore the danger." Caldwell, weary, replied with more heat than was his custom. "Is faith so weak, Reverend, that a child's presence unravels it? If so, it is not faith but fancy." Still, when the clergyman departed, Caldwell sat long into the night, the boy's eyes reflecting the fire with that argent shimmer, and wondered whether he argued from conviction or fear of admitting the truth. Matters worsened when the village council convened in secret. Though Caldwell was not summoned, he learned from a sympathetic neighbor that men had spoken of remedies, of prayer, of confinement, of sending the boy away into the woods with a loaf of bread and letting Providence decide. "It is not cruelty," one man reportedly said, "but caution. If he be natural, he will survive. If not, then we are rid of him." Such words chilled Caldwell to his marrow. He redoubled his guardianship, refusing to let the boy stray unaccompanied, even for the smallest errand. Yet he could not watch him every hour, and in the intervals of solitude, new rumors blossomed. The boy himself remained aloof from the growing storm. He rarely spoke, save in that strange unearthly tongue, and when he did, the syllables curled in the ear like echoes of a forgotten song. At times he seemed indifferent, at times watchful, as if studying the townsfolk in turn. One evening, as Caldwell mended a quill, he felt eyes upon him and looked up to see the child regarding him with an intensity that seemed less childlike curiosity than the gaze of one dissecting a specimen. Caldwell shivered despite the heat of the fire. He wrote in his journal that night, "I fear the greater mystery is not what he is, but what he perceives in us." The breaking point came with the storm in March, when lightning struck the steeple and set the church ablaze. Men and women rushed to form a bucket line, their cries swallowed by the wind. In the confusion, Caldwell caught sight of the boy standing in the open square, arms raised slightly, face uplifted toward the furious sky. What happened next remained forever contested. Some swore they saw the flames bend away from the crowd, curling back upon the timber as though guided by unseen hands. Others claimed the wind shifted violently, extinguishing embers that would have carried fire to nearby houses. A few insisted that the boy's eyes glowed with silver light, brighter than the lightning itself. Caldwell, who stood nearer than any, admitted only this: the fire seemed to obey a will not its own. When the blaze was subdued and the steeple a blackened husk, the people turned not with relief but with awe and dread. Some fell to their knees, crying that the Lord had sent an angel to protect them. Others, louder and more numerous, shouted of witchcraft and demanded the boy be cast out before worse befell them. Caldwell shielded him, defiant, but he felt the tide turning with a weight no man could resist. By the next morning, Ashford was a town divided. The tavern roared with arguments, the churchyard buzzed with rumor, and in kitchens mothers hushed their children with tales of the silver-eyed boy who bent fire to his will. Caldwell walked the streets with head high, yet he felt every stare like a stone cast against him. His notebooks filled with observations, his nights filled with unease. For even as he defended the child against superstition, a deeper terror grew in his heart. What if the villagers were not entirely wrong? The night the storm came down upon Ashford was one that men would recall with trembling voices even years later, as though memory itself resisted its telling. March had not yet given way to spring, and the land lay clutched in winter's fist. The sky had been heavy all that day, swollen with black clouds rolling inland from the coast, their bellies bruised with the promise of thunder. By dusk, the town was wrapped in a silence so taut that even the dogs refused to bark, as if the earth itself were drawing breath. Then, without warning, the heavens broke. A wind rose fierce enough to wrench shutters from their hinges. The first crack of thunder shook the steeple of the church, and lightning followed, tearing the sky open in sheets of white fire. Families huddled inside their homes, candles guttering, while the storm beat against the rooftops with fists of rain and hail. The villagers later said they had never seen its like. The river surged, trees bent double, and the lanes became torrents of mud and slush. It was into this maelstrom that Timothy Caldwell, unable to sleep, paced his narrow study, quill in hand, struggling to set down his unease about the child who sat by the hearth, unmoved by the chaos outside. The boy had been restless that evening. Though he made no sound, his eyes seemed fixed upon the storm, as though he understood its rhythms more deeply than the roll of scripture or the sound of human speech. When the thunder struck, his lips curved faintly, neither in smile nor frown, but with an expression that suggested recognition, as if a long, absent companion had returned. Caldwell, unsettled, tried to occupy himself with notes, but the quill scratched nonsense across the page. Each time he looked up, the boy's silver gaze was fixed upon the window, where the lightning lit the panes like burning glass. The disaster began with a single bolt. Witnesses swore the heavens split in two, and the air itself turned white. The church steeple, proud and tall above the village, received the blow. With a sound like the tearing of the world, fire leapt from spire to roof, consuming dry timber with unnatural speed. The bells, jarred from their frame, tolled once, twice, then fell silent as smoke poured into the sky. Cries rose from the houses, and people flooded into the square, stumbling through rain and hail toward the blaze. Caldwell, dragging the boy with him, was among the first to arrive. The fire raged wildly, driven by the gale, and it seemed certain the entire structure would be lost. Men formed a line to the well, passing buckets hand to hand, while women clutched their children and prayed aloud. Yet the flames resisted all effort, climbing higher as though nourished by the storm itself. And then the murmurs began, for in the midst of the chaos, the boy had broken free of Caldwell's grasp. He stood alone in the open square, rain cascading over his thin form, his face uplifted to the inferno. His arms rose slightly, palms open as though in supplication. For one impossible instant, the gale itself seemed to shift. Those nearest swore the flames bent away from the crowd, curling back upon themselves, refusing to leap from roof to roof. Buckets of water struck the fire with unnatural precision, dousing places no hand had aimed for. The lightning cracked again, yet this time its force seemed diverted, striking earth harmlessly beyond the town. What all agreed upon was this: the fire did not spread. Though the steeple collapsed in ruin and the church roof caved, the blaze remained contained within those walls until at last it sputtered out in a hiss of steam. The people of Ashford, soaked, breathless, and trembling, looked upon the blackened skeleton of their sanctuary, and then turned as one toward the boy. In his argent eyes there flickered the dying glow of the flames, and for a heartbeat, silence hung heavier than the storm. Then came the voices. Some cried out in gratitude, calling him a miracle sent from heaven to preserve them. They fell to their knees in the mud, weeping and crossing themselves, declaring that no ordinary child could command fire's path. Others recoiled in terror, shrieking witchcraft, warning that no power not of God could bend the elements to its will. "He has brought the storm upon us," one man cried. "He will bring worse yet." Another pointed, trembling, declaring that the boy's eyes burned brighter than the fire itself. Caldwell rushed to shield him, drawing the child close and shouting above the din, "You see what you wish to see. The storm struck the steeple as storms have always done. The fire was quenched by water, not by sorcery. Do not give superstition dominion over reason." His voice, however, was drowned beneath the clamor. Mothers clutched their children, men gripped one another's arms, and the boy himself neither struggled nor sought comfort. He simply gazed, expressionless, at the faces twisted in awe and fear. That night, the town did not sleep. In tavern and kitchen alike, arguments raged. To some, the boy was a guardian angel who had spared them. To others, he was the source of their peril. The fire had not consumed their homes only because he willed it so, and if he could command fire to spare, then he could command it to destroy. A power that saves is a power that threatens. Caldwell, alone at his desk, wrote furiously in his journal, his words blotted by rain that still dripped from his sleeves. "If I had doubted before, I can doubt no longer. The phenomena are real, yet whether they be natural, undiscovered, or supernatural, I cannot yet judge. But the people will not wait for judgment. Their verdict is already upon their tongues." By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving the village hushed beneath a gray sky. Smoke lingered in the air, acrid and heavy. The church, once the heart of Ashford, stood as a charred skeleton, its bell cracked upon the ground. Families wandered the square in silence, staring at the ruins, while others whispered together in tight knots, eyes darting toward Caldwell's house. Caldwell himself sat by the hearth, staring at the boy who sat opposite him with hands folded in his lap. Not once had he spoken since the fire. His eyes, when they met Caldwell's, seemed deeper than ever, reflecting no flame, no fear, no triumph, only a silence that pressed like weight upon the air. Later, in testimony recorded by the county, Caldwell wrote, "That night I beheld the laws of nature mocked before my eyes. The fire curved from its course. The wind obeyed no pattern known to science. If the child did not command it, then some force acted in his presence that lent him its aspect. Whether angel, demon, or instrument of laws yet hidden, I cannot say. Only this, the town will not forgive such strangeness. They will call for his removal, and should they act, I fear they will not stop at removal." In the weeks that followed, the boy's presence became unbearable to many. Families who had cried miracle one night awoke the next to whispers of blasphemy. Caldwell felt the tension coiling tighter with each day, as though Ashford itself were a vessel filled to the brim, waiting for a tremor to spill its contents. Yet the boy gave no sign of concern. He drifted through the house with the quiet patience of a scholar waiting for an experiment to unfold. And Caldwell, exhausted, realized he had come to dread not only the townsfolk, but the calm composure of the child within his care. The weeks after the fire marked a turning point not only in Ashford's regard for the boy, but in Timothy Caldwell's own descent into a fever of obsession. It would not be inaccurate to say that the night of the steeple's collapse set the man upon a course that he could no longer abandon, as if every rational thread of his mind had been bound to the inexplicable figure who slept beneath his roof. In the town, the whispers grew more poisonous each day, mutating like a sickness, spreading from the tavern to the market, from the market to the very pews of the makeshift chapel they had erected in the hall of the schoolhouse. But within Caldwell's study, the fever of another kind burned, the fever of inquiry, of compulsion, of a man who must tear apart every veil until truth lay naked before him, no matter the cost. Caldwell's notebooks multiplied. Once the proud journals of a gentleman physician, they now bore an appearance more akin to the fever charts of a madhouse doctor, pages upon pages filled with his jagged script, his ink-stained hands moving long into the night. He recorded every gesture the boy made, every blink, every change in his breathing, the precise angle at which his head turned when thunder rolled or when flame flickered upon the hearth. He measured the boy's pulse with the rigor of a surgeon, his temperature with crude mercury apparatus, his reflexes with improvised tests. The boy, curiously, never resisted. He endured Caldwell's examinations as calmly as he endured the suspicious stares of the townsfolk, sitting still, eyes steady, as though he himself were curious to see how far the man would go. The results, however, defied explanation. Caldwell measured a pulse too slow for a child, yet too strong for weakness. He noted that fever never touched him, though the cold of March clung like ice to the bones of every other child in Ashford. He ate little, yet did not waste away. He slept irregularly, yet his gaze each morning was clear, untroubled. When he cut his finger on the edge of a broken glass, the wound closed within a day, leaving no trace. Caldwell wrote, "I confess my instruments, crude though they be, may deceive me, but I cannot deny the evidence of my own eyes. This boy does not conform to any condition of life known to science or medicine." Sleep abandoned Caldwell. Each night, while the village settled into uneasy dreams, he remained at his desk, quill scratching furiously, or else pacing before the hearth, muttering fragments of scripture and natural philosophy alike. He summoned volumes from Boston treatises on magnetism, mesmerism, galvanism, the hidden properties of flame and lightning. He borrowed ancient manuscripts from the minister, arguing that the old church fathers had hinted at mysteries modern science refused to confront. He devoured them all, scribbling margins with furious comparisons, searching for a thread that might tie together the contradictions before him. Yet with each passing day, reason slipped further from his grasp. For every note he made in favor of a scientific cause, 10 more suggested something beyond nature's law. He caught himself staring at the boy for hours, quill frozen in hand, certain that if he looked long enough, some secret would reveal itself in the shifting silver of those eyes. And when at last he collapsed into uneasy sleep, he dreamt not of patience and remedies but of storm clouds gathering over Ashford, of fire bending like a serpent, of a child standing at the heart of it all, neither weeping nor smiling, only watching. The villagers began to notice his decline. They saw him stalking the lanes with hollow eyes, forgetting his hat in the rain, muttering half-formed words as he hurried past. The mothers drew their children close when he approached, and men turned away, whispering that he had fallen under the boy's spell. The minister called upon him, urging him to release the child to other care, lest his name be blackened beyond repair. Caldwell drove him from the threshold, declaring that ignorance was the true enemy, not the boy. "Would you burn what you do not understand?" he thundered. "Would you tear down the very ladder that might lift us closer to truth?" His voice cracked, and when the door shut, he leaned against it, trembling, sweat chilling his skin. In his journal he confessed his own terror. "Am I guardian or jailer? Am I protecting this boy from the town, or the town from the boy? I cannot tell, but the thought of him removed from me fills me with dread beyond reason. He is no longer subject of study alone. He is, what word to use, the axis upon which my very soul has begun to turn." It was then that Caldwell's experiments turned darker. He began to test the boy in secret ways he did not confess to any man. He held candles close to his skin to see if flame recoiled, and swore that though the wax melted, the boy's flesh did not blister. He placed iron near his hand and noted the faintest tremor in the needle of a compass. He read passages of scripture aloud, searching for a flicker of response, and then passages of pagan texts, alchemical formulae, words from forbidden treatises smuggled from old libraries. Through it all, the boy sat silent, neither rebelling nor submitting, only watching with those fathomless eyes. Once, during a storm, Caldwell dragged him outside to the edge of the square. Lightning lit the heavens, and Caldwell, drenched and wild-eyed, shouted over the roar, demanding that the boy reveal his power. "If it is within you, then show me, for God's sake, what you are." The boy merely tilted his head, rain streaming down his face, and the lightning struck a tree beyond the field. Caldwell fell to his knees, sobbing, torn between awe and despair. The boy did not move to comfort him. He simply turned and walked back toward the house, leaving Caldwell trembling in the mud. Meanwhile, Ashford's patience frayed. A cow dead without cause was blamed upon the boy. A stillborn child was whispered to have been his doing. Shadows on a wall, a candle extinguished by draught. Any misfortune became proof of his unnatural presence. Caldwell's house, once a place of respect, became the focus of suspicion. Stones were found upon his windowsill, thrown by unseen hands. Children dared one another to run past the gate, shrieking that the witch boy would seize them. Caldwell barred his shutters and worked by lamplight, the boy sitting quietly nearby as though the storm outside had no bearing upon him. And yet Caldwell loved him. In that terrible, fevered way that obsession disguises itself as affection, he grew convinced that the boy was not curse but revelation. He told himself that God, or nature, or fate had chosen him alone to bear witness. If the world turned its back in fear, he would stand steadfast. If the village clamored for blood, he would shield the child with his own. In his darkest moments, he even thought, "If the boy is demon, then I will follow him into damnation. If angel, then into glory, for without him I am nothing but dust." That spring, Caldwell wrote fewer notes and more prayers, though they were prayers only in form, for their addressee was uncertain. "Show me," he wrote over and over again in trembling ink. "Show me why you are here. Show me what you mean. Show me what lies beyond the veil of human sight." The boy, as always, gave no answer. The unease that had simmered beneath Ashford since the fire did not fade with the passing of weeks. If anything, the rumors multiplied in the spring, ere like flies upon carrion, clinging to every household, every table where families bent their heads to eat. Once, the villagers had spoken of the boy in hushed tones, fearful of summoning his name. Now they spoke of him openly, voices sharpened by anger and dread, as if to pronounce his presence aloud gave them mastery over their own terror. Ashford was a small place, and small places cannot bear long with mysteries. What cannot be explained must be judged, and what is judged, if found wanting, must be punished. It began with murmurs at the tavern, men whispering of livestock gone missing, of milk curdling in the pail, of infants crying without cease. It grew in the pews of the schoolhouse chapel, where sermons against the devil's cunning seemed to stretch longer each week, punctuated by glances at Caldwell's empty bench. It swelled in the market square when a cart overturned and a horse bolted, and some swore they had seen the boy standing nearby, silent, his gaze fixed upon the beast before it reared. By early May, there was scarcely a household that did not carry some tale, some scrap of misfortune laid at the boy's feet. Caldwell knew it. He felt the eyes upon him when he fetched provisions, when he carried water from the well, when he passed beneath the budding trees that lined the main road. He bore the whispers like a cloak, but he would not abandon the boy. In his journal he wrote, "The town's verdict is already formed, though they have yet to speak it aloud. They will not permit what they fear to remain. They will act as mobs always act, not from reason but from hunger, hunger for certainty, for an end to dread. And when they act, they will not seek understanding but purgation. If they must cast him as demon to soothe their minds, then demon he shall be in their eyes, no matter what truth lies within him." The turning point came with the death of the blacksmith's eldest son. The boy had been strong, scarcely 14, and in the bloom of health. Yet one evening he collapsed in the lane, lips blue, chest still, though no illness had troubled him before. His mother wailed that she had seen the strange child not 2 hours earlier, watching from the edge of the square. That was enough. By nightfall, half the town was convinced the boy had stolen the breath from the youth, drawing life from him as easily as flame draws air. On the following Sabbath, the minister's sermon broke into fury. "There is among us a corruption," he thundered, his voice trembling against the rafters. "A thing in the shape of a child, but no child. We have sheltered it, and now it demands its price. Will you stand idle as your homes are cursed, your sons struck down, your souls imperiled? Or will you cast out the unclean thing as Israel cast out Amalek?" Cries of "Amen," and cast him out shook the benches. By the time the congregation spilled into the sunlight, the verdict was sealed in their hearts. That evening, Caldwell was warned by a neighbor whose pity outweighed his fear. The man slipped to Caldwell's door in the dusk, eyes darting nervously, and whispered that the town would come before the week was out. "They will not ask you," he said. "They will not wait upon your leave. They will take him. Better you send him away now, for his sake and yours." Caldwell gripped the man's arm, demanding who had spoken such plans, but the neighbor shook his head. "All of them. It is not one voice, doctor. It is the whole of Ashford." Then he fled into the shadows, leaving Caldwell with a chill heavier than any storm. That night Caldwell could not write. He sat by the hearth, hands shaking, staring at the boy who sat across from him with his customary stillness. "They mean to destroy you," Caldwell said hoarsely. "Do you hear me? They mean to cast you out, to kill you, though you have done nothing." The boy gave no reply. His eyes, pale as mercury, reflected the weak flame of the lamp. Caldwell pressed on, desperate, almost pleading. "You must let me take you away. I will bring you to Boston, to scholars who may understand, to men who will not fall to superstition. We must leave before they come." Still no answer, only that steady, inhuman patience. Caldwell struck the table with his fist. "Do you understand? They will burn you." His voice cracked, and he sank back into his chair, trembling. The boy blinked once, slowly, as though to acknowledge the words, but not their weight. Days dragged in dread. Caldwell scarcely slept, ears straining for the sound of boots upon the lane. When he ventured into the square, he found conversations stilled at his approach. Men turned their backs, women drew their children away. A silence of decision hung over the town, like the pause before a blade descends. Caldwell returned each night with his heart pounding, certain he would find his door barred by a crowd. It came at last on a Thursday evening, as twilight bled into darkness. Caldwell had just set his pen aside when the distant murmur of voices reached his ears. He rose, blood turning cold. Through the shutters he glimpsed torches, a wavering procession of light advancing from the square. The sound grew clearer, the tread of boots, the rumble of angry voices, the cries of men who had convinced themselves of righteousness. He turned to the boy, who stood already at the center of the room, waiting, as though he had foreseen this hour. "They will not take you," Caldwell whispered. "Do you hear me? I will not permit it." His hands shook as he barred the door, dragged furniture against it, seized the hunting rifle from above the hearth. The roar outside swelled, fists upon the wood, voices demanding, "Bring him out, bring out the witch child." The shutters rattled as stones struck them. Caldwell raised his voice in reply, shouting, "He is no demon, he is no witch. You damn yourselves with your ignorance." His words were lost in the clamor. The door buckled under the weight of the crowd. Caldwell stood before it, rifle in hand, heart hammering. Behind him the boy remained still, untouched by fear. The moment stretched, a terrible stillness within the storm of voices. Caldwell thought wildly that the boy might yet reveal his power, might scatter the mob with fire or wind as he had tamed the blaze weeks before. But the boy only watched, his gaze fixed not on the door but on Caldwell himself, as though awaiting his choice. Then the wood split, and the night came pouring in. The night the door gave way was the last night Timothy Caldwell's name was spoken in Ashford without a shudder. The mob burst into the house in a torrent of rage, torches casting wild shadows upon the walls, voices rising in a clamor that blurred the line between righteous fury and madness. Caldwell stood in their path, rifle raised, his features drawn into a mask of desperation. For a moment the crowd faltered, faced with the figure of a man they had once respected, a physician who had brought children into the world and closed the eyes of the dying. But fear is stronger than gratitude, and one voice cried out, "He is bewitched." Another shouted, "Stand aside or perish with him." The press of bodies surged forward. Caldwell fired once, the crack echoing like thunder within the small room. A torch dropped, sputtering against the floorboards, though the flames did not spread. The men fell back, startled, and for an instant silence hung in the smoky air. Then Caldwell's voice rose above them, raw and hoarse. "You fools, you blind, trembling beasts, you call this boy demon, yet it is your own ignorance that damns you. Would you kill what you do not understand? Would you destroy the very key to knowledge?" His chest heaved, his hands trembling upon the rifle. Behind him the boy stood motionless, eyes fixed on the mob, their silvery depths catching the wavering light, but reason could not reach them. The blacksmith, his face twisted with grief and fury, surged forward with a cry, and others followed. Caldwell was struck aside, his rifle torn from his grasp, his body thrown against the wall. He crumpled to the floor, blood at his temple, the breath knocked from his lungs. The mob pressed on, surrounding the boy. And here accounts diverge. For what happened next, no two witnesses could recount the same way. Some swore the torches guttered and died, though no hand smothered them. Others claimed the air grew so hot it scorched their throats, forcing them to stagger back. A few muttered that the boy's eyes flared with a brilliance not of this world, blinding them for an instant. One woman swore she heard a sound, not of human voice, but like the deep toll of a bell underwater, reverberating through her bones. And there were those who claimed the boy lifted his hands, not in violence but in some silent appeal, and that the storm which had lain dormant since winter stirred once more, rattling shutters, shaking the ground beneath their feet. Whatever the truth, the mob broke. Panic rippled through them like fire through dry brush. Men who had marched with conviction moments before now stumbled backward, tripping over one another in their haste to flee. Torches dropped, boots pounded the earth, and within minutes the house stood empty save for Caldwell and the boy. Caldwell, staggering to his feet, stared at the child in awe and terror. "What are you?" he whispered, voice raw with blood and fear. The boy said nothing. His gaze lingered on Caldwell for a moment longer, then drifted toward the door, where the night stretched wide and waiting. At dawn, the village awoke to silence. Caldwell's house stood open, the door splintered, the hearth cold. Of the boy, there was no sign. Some claimed he had fled into the forest, vanishing like mist into the pines. Others whispered he had risen into the storm that broke over the hills that night, carried away by forces no man could name. A few muttered darker things, that he had consumed the rage of the mob itself, feeding upon their fear until nothing remained. But no body was found, no footprint traced. The boy was gone as though he had never been. Caldwell, however, remained, though changed beyond recognition. He was discovered 2 days later, wandering the lanes of Ashford with eyes hollow and speech broken, clutching a soot-stained notebook against his chest. When pressed, he would only mutter fragments, a law beyond law, a child beyond nature, if only time, if only more time. The townsfolk, shaken and ashamed, did not press further. Some pitied him, others spat at his passing, but none dared speak openly of what they had done. He left Ashford before summer's end, taking with him nothing but his journals, and his name was scarcely mentioned again except in whispers. Years later, a bundle of his papers was discovered among the archives of a Boston society, misfiled among medical treatises. The pages were stained, the ink smeared, yet the words still burned with feverish intensity. They spoke of a boy who felt no cold, who bore no wound, who bent fire and storm as if by instinct, yet spoke not a word. They spoke of a town driven to madness by its own fear, of a guardian who became a prisoner of his own obsession, and they ended with a single line, written in a hand so desperate the quill had torn through the page. The boy science could not explain. The fate of the child was never learned. Some said he had walked beyond the village and kept walking, crossing rivers and mountains until he was swallowed by the vastness of the world. Others believed he lingered in the hidden places, neither aging nor changing, waiting for a time when men might see him without fear. A few whispered he was no child at all, but the herald of something greater, a sign of mysteries the world was not yet ready to bear. Whatever the truth, Ashford bore the scar of his passing. The church was rebuilt, families went on with their lives, but when the wind howled over the fields or lightning forked across the sky, men and women turned their faces away, remembering the night they had looked into eyes that reflected neither mercy nor malice, only an unfathomable silence. And so the story slipped into legend, then into silence, as such stories often do. Yet among Caldwell's papers, preserved in brittle ink, one can trace the outline of a truth too strange to dismiss, too troubling to accept. Perhaps, in some forgotten corner of the world, the boy still walks, untouched by time, watching, waiting, his silver eyes bearing witness to the fear and wonder of mankind. Or perhaps he was nothing more than the fevered invention of a lonely physician, a projection of obsession and grief. But there are those who insist otherwise. They say that when the storm gathers heavy and the night burns with fire, a figure is seen at the edge of the field, small, silent, and ageless. And in his gaze lies the same riddle that confounded Timothy Caldwell and condemned a village to its fear, a riddle that no science has yet explained, nor perhaps ever will.